Welcome to Chapter 3 of our game design project, in which we're creating an action RPG Zelda-like game in Unity. We had just finished Chapter 2, which was player attacks, and you may or may not have implemented the chargeable fireball. So this video actually is fine either way if you did or didn't, because we're going to start focusing on making the animation set for this orange blob enemy that we see right now. This is different than how the player's animated because this is not different directions, so we're not going to be using blended trees. And so this video is going to be kind of different than how we set up the player. And then any future enemies that we add that actually fit any of the old patterns, I'm just going to release as a finished Unity package so you can skip over the tedious part of building the animations. So with that said, let's get into making the blob and actually fixing something from video 2.10. So if you did choose to do the optional chargeable fireball, I did actually find one bug when I was playtesting it. And that's actually if you melee attack while you're holding down the right mouse button. You can actually go and test that if you pause this and go try. Hold down the right mouse button to charge up an attack, and then while you're still holding the right mouse button, click the left mouse button. And what that will do is actually cancel your charge and then make a melee attack, but it will cause a null pointer exception due to the charge bar not getting properly deleted. So if you wanted to fix that inside of the method for your melee attack, now if you did not implement the chargeable fireball, this is going to be in a slightly different place. But this is only for if you did implement the chargeable fireball. And so go find the update melee attack and add these 3 lines that have the comment 2.10 fix. We need to destroy the charge bar, disable the fact that I'm charging, and then set my charge level back to 0. If we were to launch a sword attack, that cancels us out of the charge. That's the only bit of coding that we're going to look at. But, all right, so let's begin by importing the graphics we need for the blob. Well, I guess we need to make a folder for it inside of textures. So I'm going to right-click on textures and go to create folder. I'm going to call it enemy because I plan on creating several different enemies that I'm going to put inside this enemy folder. Then I'm going to right-click and create another folder called Orange Blob. You can have spaces or no spaces. It doesn't actually affect anything. So once we've done that, I'm going to take these sprites. And notice that this is not a sprite sheet, so this is going to be kind of different because we're going to actually animate using individual sprite graphics. And I'm going to drag and drop them into the Orange Blob folder. Alright, with that done, I can minimize this, and we have a bunch of orange blob sprites. I'm going to group select them by clicking either the top of the list or the bottom of the list and highlighting all of them by holding Shift. And I do want to tweak a few things here, and you're welcome to change these based on your preferences, but the blob itself is actually a very large sprite. In fact, if we look at it, it is almost 500 pixels by 400 pixels. So it is very high in terms of pixel size. So the pixels per unit I want is 512. And I thought it looked fine with the bilinear filter. But it is a single sprite. It is not a multi-sprite. So we don't actually have to go in and slice it. And then so we just click apply. And all of these blobs will then be set correctly. So what we want to do now is start creating the game entity for the blob. So I'm going to start with, well, we could just drag and drop it in. So let's just take orange blob idle 1 and drag and drop it into the hierarchy. That actually creates a game object with a sprite renderer built into it. So you can see that it places it at 0, 0. Let's move it off to the side just so I can look at it. And you can kind of see the relative size compared to the player. If you shrink the sprite, it will make the graphics slightly smaller. Otherwise, if you're fine with that, you can leave it. And then also we can play with the scale as well. So the orange blob, let's set up some of its components that it's going to need and rename it. So I'm going to rename it from this to, taking off the idle 1, orange blob. And it needs a rigid body 2D. The settings here that we want to change, mass will be 10, linear drag will be 3, angular drag doesn't matter, gravity scale is 0, and then freeze the Z rotation. The mass and linear drag will matter because we can choose to make the blob kind of slidey from a physics standpoint, so that depending on the drag affects how quickly it recovers from getting knocked back. The mass also depends on how far it gets knocked back. So if you have something that has mass 50, it's going to be knocked back way less than something with mass 10. Then let's give it a collider so that it can actually interact with the world. And that is going to be a physics 2D circle collider. And the only thing I really want to do here is maybe drop this down to 0.5. And so you can see that the collider, it's a little generous. 0.45? Seems fine. And then you can also play with the scale if you want. And you'll notice that it does also scale the collider down. So I used 0.7 across X and Y. Z doesn't matter because it's a two-dimensional thing. And that's all it really needs right now in terms of components. It'll automatically add an animator component once we actually go to the animation settings. So I'm happy with my orange blob. And I'm going to just save just to be on the safe side. And I'm going to pull out my animation panel, which is under Windows, Animation, Animation. We'll eventually visit the animator, but we need to set up the animations first. Alright, so we have it pulled out and it says to begin animating orange blob, create an animator or an animation clip. Well, we want to make an animation clip, so click create. And it's going to want to save it. This is going to be my orange blob idle animation. So let's go to the animations folder. And then we'll go to the, well, I guess let's make a new one here for enemies. New folder, enemy. And inside of that one, orange blob. Now, this is the idle animation, so you could call it idle. But I do like to actually put the name of the enemy on it, just so that if you're just searching, you don't have 10,000 idle animations, because you have like skeleton idle, player idle, blob idle. If they're all called idle, you can't tell them apart if you did a search. So I'm going with orange blob idle. And again, you can have spaces in this one. The only thing you really can't have spaces in is code files. So orange blob idle, hit save, and we've got our thing here. So for this, I'm going to take and group select from 8 to 1 to get all these things, and I'm going to drag and drop them inside of my timeline. I can also scale them up by dragging this, so I can kind of try to make sure they all get a equal amount of distance here. And we've got this. And again, due to that issue with the fact that like it stops the animation one tick after that last one, you can see that it's only including up to 15. I am going to put another copy of idle 8 right there. So it keeps that twice. So it keeps this for 2 time units just like it did for every other one. And then the samples are going to be really fast. It is on a 60 sample rate. So I guess let's drop that down to 15. Let's go 16 just so it's a little bit more. And I don't know, there is something to be said if we wanted to rescale this so it stays on a 60 frame per second, but it really doesn't impact much. So I'm going back to 15. That way it's 1/4 of a second. easier to do the math in your head with. So that is my idle animation. Let's go and create a new clip. And we're going to call this orange blob attack. And the orange blob attack animation does have 4 frames to it, attack 1 through 4. With some very red looking teeth here. And this one, I'm going to space it out so that the final frame is on 6. So it almost takes about 1/4 of a second. Maybe we can even bump it up a little bit more. Plus that. And I am going to bring in this last one just to kind of give this last piece that same 3 ticks so that it lasts. So that's how fast it, that's on 60 frames. Let's drop it down to 15. And so we can kind of see the animation of it charging its teeth up and biting. And there's its idle animation. And the last one we need is the hurt animation. So we're going to go and make one more clip. And we will call this orange blob hurt. And we're going to bring in these 2 hit frames. And I'm going to extend it out. So this one begins at 3. Drop the samples down to 15 so it's kind of consistent. And I need to bring another copy of this in on 5 so that there's 3 ticks to the second frame, and then this is going to cause it to extend out 3 ticks as well. And so now we've got our hurt animation. All right, we can now close this, but I guess I'm just going to repack it back into my window. The other thing that I want to take a look at with my enemy animations is the attack animation. I don't want it to loop. So I'm going to make sure that this loop pose is unchecked. However, I do want the idle animation to loop. So I'm going to turn that on, and I do want the hurt to loop, so I'm going to turn those on. But I don't want the attack one to loop, so I'm not clicking that. All right, so with that, we've got our animations ready for the blob. The last thing we need to do in this video too, is to configure them inside the animator. So we can start setting up the triggers that we're going to use inside of the code to make these animations work. So with the orange blob still selected in the hierarchy, go to the animator, which is found under Window, Animation, Animator, or if you left it docked like I did, it will just be here. So we aren't using blend trees, so we do not need to delete the initial animations that it builds for us. And ideally, the entry one, the default, should be orange blob idle. If it is not, just right-click it and go to Set Layer as Default State. And it will switch it to being the default. It'll give it the orange arrow, meaning that's going to be the first thing it wants to travel to. So the triggers that I need for this thing, it doesn't really have a walking animation. And I guess pro tip for like future indie developers is legs are terrible. You will spend a lot of time animating legs of monsters. So if you're actually really kind of clever, a lot of very small indie studios, if you look, many monsters don't actually have leg animations because that is actually incredibly time consuming from an art standpoint. Anyway, let's go and start linking these things. Well, we need our parameters. So make sure that the parameters tab is selected. And the first one that we want is a trigger called attack. And the next one that we want to create is a Boolean called isHurt. And make sure that it's not selected like that. That would be bad. So from the any state, let's begin our transitions. I think the attack is the easiest one to start setting up, so let's do that first. right-click on any state and make a transition into orange blob attack. Then select the transition arrow. Let's give it the condition of the attack trigger, and let's check the settings. And none of these, well, yeah, transition time, let's drop that to 0. So it immediately jumps into the attack animation, and nothing else really needs to be bothered with. Then the attack, nothing needs changed here, although it is worth pointing out that you can change the speed of an animation. And actually, you can access this speed through code, so you can actually speed up or slow down an animation based on something's move speed. That may be something I explore, but if I did, it would be much later. And then, so we want this attack to return back to idle when it's finished. So we're actually going to right-click and make transition into blob idle. But this does not actually have any conditions for leaving. It actually is going to leave when the attack is finished. So to make sure that happens, we need to make sure we have exit time selected. And the exit time we want is 1, because that actually represents 100% of the attack animation being played. And we don't need a transition, so we can drop the transition to 0. And the chart kind of makes sense. You can see that it does the full attack, and then it immediately goes into idle. And that's all we need to do. There is no condition here, because it will leave attack at the exit time and transition back into idle. So then let's connect the hurt effect. So out of any state, we'll make a transition into hurt. And the transition trigger is going to be that the isHurt variable is true. So when we send that isHurt variable, it's going to stick us in here until we basically set it to false. The transition duration to 0, because we want it to immediately kick out of whatever animation it was in to go into the hurt when it is hit. Inside of this hurt, we don't need to change anything. It's all fine. And then make a transition back to idle. We don't want exit time because we want to stay in hurt until we're no longer in a hurt animation, and we'll transition immediately. The condition to leave is if the isHurt Boolean is set to false, and then so we'll return back to idle. And so this will link these animations together in a relatively simple kind of like finite state machine pattern. Unfortunately, though, we won't get a chance to test this until we actually jump into the coding, which we will do in the next video. And actually, the coding is going to be an interesting thing. We're going to test out some inheritance and polymorphism so that we can actually get we can write the code for enemies once, and then essentially each enemy will be able to kind of tweak it as needed when it inherits from enemy, which will be really cool. I guess before we actually wrap up, let's turn this into a prefab. Since really we're pretty much done with it, let's just switch its animation back to idle. So take our orange blob, and we need to start making it a prefab folder. So I'm going to make a new folder inside of prefabs called enemy. And I'm not going to make a subfolder because the subfolder will just have the blob. So I don't think that makes too terribly much sense. So I'm going to just take orange blob and drag and drop it. Before I do, let's reset its position back to 0. Be careful though, I did accidentally reset the scale. And now let's drag it back to the enemy folder. And you can see now we have an orange blob prefab that comes in at 0, 0, and it's got all the things that we've set up. So we are ready to code it. Like I said, it is going to probably take us, I want to say 2 videos to code it. We're going to have to do the enemy script first, and then we're going to do a specific orange blob script. But it's going to be really powerful once it's all set up, and it will allow us to make new enemies very quickly. So Thank you for watching this, and stay tuned for the next video.